Hi, in this video we'll talk about earnings per share with a simple capital structure. So earnings per share is like the income the company earned per share of common stock. If you have intermediate steps on your income statement, such as earnings from continuing operations or operating income, discontinued operations, earnings before restructuring charge or something. Whatever the case, you got to report earnings per share for each of those components, okay? So this is an example. You'd have earnings from continuing operations per share, and then your loss from discontinued operations net of tax per share, and net income per share. Okay, so we'll talk about simple capital structure in this video, where the company just has some common stock, maybe some preferred stock, but no dilutive securities. And then later in another video, we'll talk about complex capital structure, where you have securities like, say, convertible bonds, for example, that could dilute the ownership in the company and therefore dilute the earnings per share. Because it's important, guys. It's important to report that number, that diluted earnings per share number. A company might have a bunch of convertible bonds out there, and you report earnings per share of $8 a share, and the company's stock is trading at $32, and you're like, wow, that's a really good deal. I think I'll buy this stock, and it turns out that right after you buy it, those bondholders all convert into shareholders, and all of a sudden, there's 4 times as many shares outstanding, and now, earnings per share is really not that attractive anymore, is it? It's like $2 per share now. So that is why we report earnings per share, but we also report diluted earnings per share, which is what the worst case scenario, if everyone converted, for example. Another dilutive security is a stock warrant. So it's important to see it's not just companies with convertible bonds. Most companies have some number of stock options outstanding there. It's important to know that if everyone exercised them, what would the earnings per share be? Okay. Also important to note in the formula here, a few things I want to point out. One thing is that preferred dividends are subtracted on cumulative preferred stock, whether they are declared or not. So if the stock is not cumulative, you don't have to subtract preferred dividends if you don't have any this year. But if the preferred stock is cumulative, where the dividend accumulates, then you need to subtract it whether you declare it or not. Another thing I want to point out is you're not dividing simply by the number of shares outstanding at the end of the year. Your number of shares during the year can vary. We're dividing it by the weighted average number of shares outstanding. And we're going to talk about what that means here in a second. So essentially, you're going to weight the shares outstanding by the fraction of the period that they were outstanding. So if you have 100,000 shares at the beginning of the year, and then say towards the end of the year, we'll say October 1st, for example, you issue another 100,000 shares, and so at the end of the year you have 200,000, you're going to weight the 100,000 by 9 out of 12, because that is the period that they were outstanding, is 9 months out of the 12 months total. And you're going to weight the 200,000 by 3 out of 12, okay? So the actual weighted average number of shares outstanding you had that period is, let's see here, 100,000 times 9 out of 12 is like 75,000, plus the 200,000 times 3 out of 12, it's like 50,000. So it'd be 125,000 in that case. It's a quick example for you. That's what we're doing. Here's a more comprehensive example with Ibaka Incorporated. They had a lot of changes to their common stock during the year, and so we have a great example to work with. You can see they're starting out with 90,000 shares outstanding. They issue more shares on April 1st here, bringing their total to 120. And then on July 1st, they're going to buy back some of their own stock. So they only have 81,000 shares at that point. And then on November 1st, they issue more stock for cash again. And they end up at 141. So using this information, we're going to compute the weighted average number of shares outstanding for Ibaca Incorporated. And here is how we do it. You're going to want to make a little chart like the one here at the bottom. And so you're going to have the first column is dates outstanding. So your first period is January 1st up until April 1st. Everything was the same during that period. You had 90,000 shares. You're going to take those 90,000, you're going to multiply them by 3 out of 12 because January, February, March, and it was April 1st, so you're not going to count April. So 3 months out of 12, you're going to weight it by that, and you're going to get 22,500. Then on April 1st, you issued 30,000 more shares. You had 120, right? You had 120. You're going to weight that 120 by 3 out of 12 again, because that only lasted until July 1st. So you got April, May, June. Don't count July, because it was July 1st it happened. So 3 months again. Okay, so you're going to do the math there. You're going to get 30,000. July 1st. At that point, you purchased 39,000 shares, so you had 81,000 at that point. So you're going to write 81,000 here. How long did that last? Okay, July, August, September, October. So 4 months until November 1st. Something else happened. You issued more shares at that point. So that 81,000 is going to be weighted by 4 out of 12. Okay. On November 1st, you issued 60,000 more shares. So now you got 141. This 141 is going to be weighted by just 2 out of 12 because November, December, 2 months. All right. You weight them all. Okay, you add them up. Your denominator for EPS is 103,000 shares. All right, so that's how that works. Okay, here's another illustration. This one is a bit more complicated because we have, looks like we have a stock dividend. And you'll see how that is going to affect what we do. Essentially, when you have a stock split, you have to restate all past periods as if they were split. This is an important concept, and it's one that, in my experience, people are pretty confused by. But to me, it makes sense. Okay, to me, it makes sense. You've heard of stock splits, right? Or stock dividends. They're essentially the same idea. A company takes the existing number of shares and it divides them into more shares. So you have more shares outstanding, but no real change in the company. So when we look at past data, it's always important to restate everything so we're all on current terms. It's kind of like inflation. You know, if you've ever heard someone say, well, you know, these young people now are complaining they're only making, you know, $50,000 or $60,000 at their first job. You know, my first job paid $12,000. You hear an older person say this, right? But it's really out of place to say, of course, you know that. It's because back at the time they started working, $12,000 was the equivalent of maybe $70,000 today, for example, or $75,000. Who knows? If you really want to compare, you have to inflation adjust all the numbers. Okay, you got to take the past salary and you need to inflation adjust it so you compare it to the current. It's the same idea here. Okay, is it fair to look at a company and say, wow, their earnings per share is $2 a share. Last year it was $4 a share, yet they had a 2-for-1 stock split. Well, the reality is, of course, they have the same exact earnings per share, don't they, as they had last year. They just have twice as many shares, so it looks lower. So it's not a fair comparison, right? What would you do there? You would adjust the old number. You would say, okay, this year's EPS is $2 a share. Last year's was technically 4, but it's really like 2 since we did a stock split 2-for-1. Anyhow, let's get into it here. So here at the top, we have the data to solve the problem. And here at the bottom is the solution right here. We make the same kind of chart we made last time, but this time we have an extra column for restatement. And you'll see what we're doing here. First thing we do is we say, okay, the beginning balance was 100,000 shares. We're going to multiply 100,000 by 2 out of 12 because something happened on March 1st. We had some additional issuance of shares there. Okay. And if you could, just ignore this column B for right now. Ignore that for right now. Next thing we do is say March 1st, we issued 20,000. So now we have 120,000. And that lasted for 3 months until June 1st when we had the dividend. So March, April, May. So 3 months, yeah. Here's where you got to pay attention. Here on June 1st, you issued 60,000 more shares, but it was via a stock dividend. You have 180,000. 180,000. Now that lasted for 5 months until November 1st when you had additional issuance there. So June, July, August, September, October, 5 months. Okay. You now have to go back and write 1.5 in the previous 2 rows when you're solving this. So when you're solving this on your own, this is the point at which you go back and you write times 1.5. All right? And then you can actually fill in column D here, the last column, for those previous periods. Because if you're going to say you have 180,000 shares now, then everything in the past is understated. This 120 isn't really 120. It's like 180. You got to times by 1.5. It's as if you had 180 at that time. Essentially what we did is we just inflated the number of shares without actually issuing any, to new shareholders. And this 100,000 isn't really 100,000. It's as if you had 150. Okay? Okay, and then on November 1st, you just issued regular shares for cash, 30,000 shares, bring your total to 210. So 210 times 2 months out of 12, November and December. And that'll give you your answer there. So your weighted average number of common shares outstanding is 180 for the year. All right. And I think that is enough for this video.